All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Victoria Law. Victoria is the editor of Tenacious, Art and Writings from Women in Prison. She is the co-founder of Books Through Bars, as well as the author of Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, all of which and more you can find at resistancebehindbars.org. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me again.
All right, so Victoria, you recently wrote a piece for Truth Out on California's massively overpopulated prisons and how the state is actually constructing a new private for-profit prison to try to deal with that. But before we get to the for-profit prison side of this, discuss for us just how overcrowded are prisons in California.
So in 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that California's prison system was massively overcrowded, and they actually issued and this overcrowding led to medical neglect for people inside prisons that constituted cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution. And it ordered California to reduce its prison population to 137% of capacity. So they didn't say drop it down to an even
capacity.
100%. They said it used to be a little overcrowded, but not as massively overcrowded as you currently are. And much of the focus of this has been on California's men's prison population, in which we've seen stories and reports of men sleeping in hallways and gymnasiums and cafeterias because there's just no room to put all these people who've been sentenced under California's mandatory minimum sentences, being violated for parole, et cetera, et cetera. What we're not seeing so much is how this affects women going into the California prison system. So to address this in 2011/early 2012, the California Department of Corrections said, okay, well, to address the extreme overcrowding in men's prisons, which seems to be what people are looking at and focusing on, we're going to convert one of our 3 women's prisons, which are already kind of overcrowded, but not as extremely overcrowded, to a men's prison. And we're going to take the 1,000 or so women who are in this prison and stuff them into the remaining 2 prisons, thus making them much more overcrowded. So that's sort of the background as to the overcrowding in the California prison system. And as of last month, when I was writing the article, one of the women's prisons, like Central California Women's Facility, which originally was built to hold 2,004 women, is at 185% capacity with 3,700 women crammed in. And the other large women's prisons, the California Institution for Women, was built for about 1,400 people and currently has 2,101 women. So it's at 150% capacity. So we have this idea that we can just kind of like shuffle people around, cram them in, maybe send some of them off to private prisons out of state. And now California is also looking to, quote unquote, address their overcrowding of women's prisons by contracting with for-profit private prison corporation, the GEO Group, to build a 260-bed private prison for women.
Wow. Well, let's actually, before we get to Geo Group, and because they're horrible and stuff, and we'll definitely talk about them. Let's talk a little bit about a good part of the article that you wrote on Truth Out actually focuses on the horrific conditions and how much it's actually affecting the health of these women. You write that CIW had 5 deaths in 2013, 5 in 2014. Before all the population shuffling happened, they had like 1 death in prison. And so, I mean, clearly people are dying, prisoners are dying because of this. Talk a little bit about the conditions and how the lack of decent medical care is happening due to this overcrowding.
Well, this medical care in California's women's prisons wasn't great. Maybe not even adequate before, this one of the prisons was converted into a men's prison. So I don't want to paint a picture of everything was hunky-dory beforehand. But we see with this massive overcrowding that conditions have gone way downhill. So, I mean, if we look at the California Institution for Women, in 2012, there was 1 death for the whole year. In 2013, there were 5. And then in January to April of 2014, there were 5
So
deaths.
far.
So far. So what's going on here? That there are as many deaths in 4 months than there were in the entirety of last year, and that's 5 times as many as in the year before. And from women who've come out of CIW and from reports coming from people still incarcerated in CIW, they're talking about the fact that because the prison is massively overcrowded, they're often locked into their cells, which means people can't get to, say, medical visits. They can't get they can't get access to their medicines. It also means that sometimes people are locked into their cells when maybe they should not ever really be locked into their cells 23.5 to 24 hours a day. But for people who might need more constant monitoring, they're not getting that. So say if somebody is feeling depressed and might be suicidal, they're not getting the kind of support they might need either from their fellow women or any kind of psychiatric help because they're locked in their cells with just themselves and their thoughts for 23.5 to 24 hours a day. If something happens to somebody while they're locked into their cell, it doesn't necessarily mean that the guard on duty or the staff members on duty are going to necessarily see that as they're making their rounds once every however many hours. So there have been reports that one woman died after having a stroke. So she was in one of the segregation units, and one of the disturbing things about this extreme overcrowding in the women's prisons is that women are sent to solitary confinement, sometimes for breaking a rule, sometimes because they're not accepting the housing assignments they've been given, because they might say, I had a problem with this particular group of women back when we were all in another prison together. I don't want to be housed there because I fear for my safety. So the prison's answer then is to place them in solitary confinement. This also means that if once a woman's solitary confinement term is up, so say you have a pair of tweezers and you are sentenced to a year in solitary confinement, after that year is up, because they don't have a bed space for you, they'll say, well, because there's no available bed space for you, you're going to spend the rest of your sentence in solitary confinement because there's no available space. So I want to give this as, sort of background information, because there was one death that occurred fairly recently between January and April of 2014, where a woman who was in solitary confinement, nobody is quite able to say why, but she may have been in solitary confinement for a rules violation. She may have been in there for refusing to accept housing. She may be in there because there was no room for her elsewhere. But she had a stroke when she was in solitary confinement, and she was in her early 30s. I believe she was 32. So kind of young to be having a stroke. And this should have raised all sorts of medical red flags, like why is a 32-year-old woman having a stroke? So she was removed from her solitary confinement cell, brought to the prison infirmary, treated, and then within a few weeks brought back, placed back in her solitary confinement cell, where she then suffered another stroke and died. And so why was she then taken from the infirmary, placed in solitary confinement where nobody could keep an eye on her? There's not somebody who can then say, hey, wait a minute, we need to be constantly monitoring her. We need to make sure that she's getting access to her medications. We need to make sure that, something doesn't happen and she doesn't relapse. And there's not so much time that passes before anybody notices that there's a medical problem, and we need to immediately get her medical attention.